Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I am staff writer Cody Goodwin, and I'm glad you're here. Happy Friday. Busy weekend in Alabama sports coming up. Opening day for Alabama baseball. Alabama softball kicked off last weekend, but they're at Rhodes for their home opening weekend. Both men's and women's hoops are at home this weekend. The men play Texas A&M. The women play Auburn, the Iron Bowl of women's basketball. I don't know if that's what we call that, but maybe. That's on Sunday if you're into that kind of thing. Men play on Saturday. Today's show, we're going to talk some hoops. We're also going to talk some football. And we are joined by Mike Rodak. Mike, this is our 50th episode of Roll Pod. Can you believe it?
I'm floored. I can't. It's when did we start? September?
Like late August, early September. I think the first two episodes were like previewing football.
7 months into it, maybe.
Yeah.
50 episodes in 7 months. All right. I like it. I like the pace we're on.
It's that 50 divided by 7, about 7 shows per month. Ish. You know, like some weeks we had 3, some weeks like this week we had 1 because you were out on vacation, you were at Disney. I'm battling a small cough. And we wanted to give Brett a break from recruiting stuff because Lord knows he could probably use a break after everything that he's been doing since December. So yeah, we're here with just one episode this week. Gonna talk some basketball because men's hoops entering the home stretch of their season. 7 games left in the regular season, starting with Saturday's game against Texas A&M. Tip off at 11 a.m. Central at Coleman. We'll get to that hoops conversation on the second half of today's show. Mike, I wanted to start here. Earlier this week, Matt Zenitz reported that Alabama has filled its offensive coordinator position, promoting Nick Sheridan up from tight ends coach. He takes over after Ryan Grubb left to become the OC for the Seattle Seahawks. We'll talk about Sheridan, what that could mean for Alabama in a moment, but I first wanted to talk about Grubb and the trend that we're seeing, more and more college coaches leaving for the NFL. Grubb is merely one in a long line of college coaches who have left for the NFL this hiring cycle. Scott Huff, who is expected to be Alabama's offensive line coach, is joining Grubb in Seattle. Tommy Rees, Alabama's former offensive coordinator, recently joined the Cleveland Browns. I think that was a little bit more he was out of a job in Tuscaloosa, but longtime college assistant, now in the pro game. If you look around the college landscape, you'll find plenty of examples, right? Jim Harbaugh left Michigan to go to the LA Chargers. Jeff Hafley, Boston College to become Green Bay Packers defensive coordinator. You look down the list, Charlie Mullen went from Illinois to the New York Giants. Doug Mallory from Michigan to the Baltimore Ravens. Jay Harbaugh went from Michigan to Seattle. Charlie Partridge, Pittsburgh to the Indianapolis Colts. Liam Cohen, who I know has kind of bounced back and forth between the pro and the college game. He's now with Tampa Bay. On and on and on and on and on. There's plenty of examples all around the country. There have been a few coaches that have migrated from the pro game to the college game, but the vast majority of these coaching moves are going from college to the pros. There's a ton of reasons for this that we're probably going to get into, but Mike, I do wonder if this is something that college football fans and just the sport in general should be worried about. What do you think?
I think to a certain extent, maybe not to the extent that you might see out there, kind of portrayed on Twitter. I think back to when I first started covering the NFL, and I remember Chip Kelly going from Oregon and eventually going where, the 49ers or the Eagles first. All this blends together already, but Chip Kelly was like supposed to be so he went to Oregon to the Eagles and the Eagles to the 49ers. And so Chip Kelly is supposed to be part of this new wave of college coaches bringing that spread offense and the no huddle offense to the NFL, and, completely flamed out. There's been a few others, college coaches that have, they've tried in the pros. Matt Rule was a disaster in Carolina. And there's been a few others that off the top of my head, I can't really remember, but
this was a while ago. But a guy named Nick Saban, he tried the pro game, came back to college, things worked out for him.
Right. And, there's different circumstances. Like, I don't know if Saban would have gone back to college if he didn't have the NFL job waiting for him. You had Bill O'Brien going from the Patriots when I was covering them to Penn State. He's bounced back and forth too. Doug Marrone, when my first year covering the Bills, they had just hired him from Syracuse. Urban Meyer was a disaster in Jacksonville. Greg Schiano was not that great in Tampa. Cliff Kingsbury is kind of a college guy who was decent for a little while in Arizona and didn't really work out. I'm looking at, winning percentages right now of college to NFL coaches since 2000. Only 2 of them, Bill O'Brien and Jim Harbaugh, are over 500. So There was
I was going to say this is another, it's been a while, but Pete Carroll made the jump from USC to Seattle, right? Like, I mean, he was able to win at both levels on a pretty regular basis for the most part.
Right. And I don't know why, honestly, I'm not really sure why he left, he's not included on that list. But yeah, he was
probably been at Seattle long enough where it's like, also like the things he did at USC caused Reggie to lose his Heisman. So,
Right. But point being is that this isn't new. Like, it's been going on for a while. And quite frankly, it's even slowed down in terms of NFL teams hiring head coaches directly from college. That has not really happened a lot recently. Really Rule was the last one, and that didn't work. And a lot of NFL teams would much rather develop a coach, especially offensive minded quarterbacks coaches. And that's where a lot of the head coaches come from these days, from the NFL system. So really it's gone the other direction, I would say, in the NFL in terms of head coaches being hired directly out of college. But I think there is maybe somewhat of a noticeable exodus. That's not even the right word, or noticeable amount of coaches leaving from college to NFL, not becoming head coaches, but becoming lower level coaches and trying to work their way up that way. And yeah, I think that is a thing. I think partly it might be due to the college game in some respects becoming a little bit closer to the pro game, and the pro game adopting some of the aspects of college. It used to be like, and every school's different, every offense is different, but it used to be like 15 years ago, close to that, when I was covering the NFL, like college offenses were just so simple and you couldn't really replicate what they were doing in the NFL. Now there is a lot of replication going on. And, especially even this year, we'll see the ACC's already done it. I think the NCAA is going to pass it in a couple of weeks, the headsets in the helmets. And that's going to be another aspect where the NFL and the college game become a lot closer. And so that learning curve, I think, has changed. I think it's smaller for a coach like Ryan Grubb going from really Washington to Seattle. In terms of what's going to be different, I think there's more of a realistic chance of his offensive system working in the NFL than maybe 10 years ago that would have been the case. So I think that's part of it. And then, there's the obvious recruiting, the quality of life and the lifestyle. The pay is going to be similar for a high level college assistant or a high level college coordinator to an NFL assistant or coordinator. So that's not going to be an issue. And then you don't have to deal with recruiting high school kids. You don't have to deal with the ridiculous aspects of recruiting that have come up in the last few years here. So I think that's an even bigger draw than it used to be, because you could recruit a kid out of high school. You won't have to worry about him for a couple of years. You won't have to worry, in most cases, about paying him. And now you do. And it's just a constant barrage of agents and high school coaches and parents and all that calling you and trying to leverage you and all the things that happen now these days with NIL and the portal. And I'm absolutely certain a lot of these coaches get sick of that. And they also get sick of dealing with the people within their own university sphere that you're trying to get money from constantly. And that's something that even Jeff Hafley mentioned, from going from Boston College to the Packers. So that's part of it. And I think the simplest change that the NCAA can make, if they still exist, is not having all the onus on recruiting on the road go on the assistant coaches. And this is something even Courtney Morgan mentioned on, the Athletic podcast that he did after he got hired by Alabama. Like, let the personnel staff go on the road and scout and recruit. That's ultimately what they're there for. But there's still this archaic rule that it can only be the assistant coaches and you can only have 10 of them. And that's another thing I think is going to change too. And we've heard chatter about that for a few years, about the number of on-field assistants, that rule going away. So it's a problem right now. Like, your assistant coach, you're one of few, you're one of 10 on the staff, and you have all this onus of recruiting on you. That's probably not going to be true in a couple of years. And whether that's because the NCAA has changed its rules, or whether there is no NCAA, or whether there's a separate entity now with the SEC and Big Ten and whatever the case may be that doesn't have those rules about coaches recruiting and number of on-field assistants, it's going to be different in a couple years. So maybe there's coaches in the NFL, if you're a quality control coach for the Broncos and you can become a wide receivers coach for Alabama or Ohio State or something like that, that could actually be a better opportunity for you in a few years if this system is redone and a lot of these problems are fixed. So it's long-winded, but I do think it's multifaceted, and I don't think it's just a very simple, oh, there's all these college coaches bolting for the NFL. Is this a problem for the game? I think it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a little bit more noticeable this cycle than maybe previously. And you mentioned Jeff Hafley's comments. Ryan Grubb made similar comments in his introductory press conference with Seattle. First and foremost, he had made the comment that the bigger factor is being able to compete on the highest level. If you aspire to do anything in sports or in life in general, like you want to be able to do it at the highest level that you can. You want to try and be the best that you can be. Totally understand that. Coaches have been doing that forever. That totally makes sense. But somebody also asked him, like, hey, the demands of the college game, like how big of a factor was that in him deciding to go now? And he was straight. He was just like, yeah, it was a factor. When you're talking about coaching, your profession, your craft, the more ability and time you have to focus on the task at hand, the better you're going to be at that. These are Ryan Grubb's words. The tough part for college football, when you're thinking about coaching your room and your team, the focus you're able to give your squad right now, just your team, that's all you're worried about. You don't have all these things coming in from the outside that you don't have to deal with and address. It gives you more opportunity to be better at your craft and provide more resources for your team. Quick follow-up question. Somebody asked if it was sustainable. He kind of chuckled and said, that's a longer conversation. They have to get it fixed. It has to get better. Obviously that played a factor into him. He also went on to say that, he was in Alabama. He was in Tuscaloosa. That was his focus on being Alabama's offensive coordinator until it wasn't. I know that's a conversation you and I have had that, he was Alabama's OC until he became Seattle's OC. He also talked about how the timing was a little less than ideal. The timing for these things are almost never perfect. But I wonder, how long is it going to take college football to fix this? Whether that's the NCAA making changes, whether that's, the college football playoff spinning off to kind of becoming the football entity that kind of governs the sport. Some of those little changes that you were talking about to maybe help ease the burden on coaches and try to make everything a little bit better. I wonder if this, if they don't get fixed, how much more of this will we see? Or if they do fix it, does Ryan Grubb stay at Alabama? I'm of the belief that he's always wanted to have an NFL coordinator job. So he was probably going to leave whenever the timing worked. But a lot of these other coaches that are jumping ship, maybe because of all the factors with college football now, I wonder if they stick it out, if, they get a little bit of help and this sport is not as ridiculous, like the month of December specifically. That was something that Courtney Morgan talked about in that Athletic interview. The month of December sucks, and
Saban
how much.
Too.
Say it again.
Saban too. I mean, Saban, I think the month of December might have been the final nail in the coffin as far as his coaching career. Because you could just tell he was worn down from everything else happening.
Yeah. And like a lot of these guys, like, you and I have talked to enough college coaches. Some of these guys just want to coach ball, and then when you got to worry about recruiting, whether it's high school kids, transfer portal, your own roster, all these kids wanting different NIL deals, their NIL agents coming at you, trying to figure out X, Y, and Z. Like, no wonder Nick Saban got tired. Right. And so I wonder, if this cycle maybe it's just me, my first year covering college football at this high of a level, like it just seems like there's a little bit more. And I wonder how much more common this will be with coaching cycles moving forward if they don't get some of these little things fixed for college football.
Yeah, and there's a few things in there, and I'll start with, I think there's some people you might read or hear from that might say, like, why would you leave Alabama to go to the NFL? And I think we talked about this on the last podcast. Like, it's Alabama, but the NFL is the NFL, and the NFL is only getting bigger. It's only getting more popular. This past Super Bowl last weekend was the most watched TV show of all time. 133 million people, I think is what the final number was, if that sounds right.
It was like 123 million on average.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like the NFL is not going anywhere. Like it's hands down
Right.
America's most popular sport. And you could argue it's on its way to challenging soccer as maybe one of the world's most popular sports.
Right. And so, even you go back to, let's say, like SEC championship was Um, 17 million. National championship in Alabama and Georgia was 28 million. So you're talking 5-6 times as many viewers for a Super Bowl than there is for a college football national championship. That's a stage that I think a lot of coaches want to be on, and that's the NFL stage. I even saw something else. I think I mentioned that stat last. Like the top 80 TV shows,
NFL
were all
broadcast.
NFL. Right. I forget the exact stat, but like the NFL had like every single.
Yeah, like 80 of the top 100 highest
Mhm.
viewed broadcasts of all time NFL games.
Yeah, I mean it's just, and it's only getting bigger every single year. So I know in Birmingham's like a very different place. Like there was even a stat this week I saw, that was a Stanford University study about what people care about. It was like college football, the NFL. Taylor Swift was on there, and Birmingham was like the one city that had college football ahead of the NFL in relation to some of its peers that were on that list. It was Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville. There's a few other cities that I saw, and that's, again, it's kind of the bubble of Alabama where college sports is number one. But I think sometimes people forget that the world is a little bit bigger in terms of football. Ryan Grubb's not from here. He's from the Midwest. He's coached in the Pacific Northwest. Like, these coaches don't have that emotional attachment to Alabama. They probably don't have quite the emotional attachment to certainly the SEC, but maybe college football in general. And it's just, it's not going to draw them in quite as much as, hell, even a Dabo Swinney, like from Birmingham, like, played at Alabama, like he's college football through and through. Like, I can't imagine him going to the NFL, but again, the world is a lot bigger than that bubble. So it does not surprise me in the least that a coach would leave Alabama to go to the NFL. The other part of that was the Ryan Grubb comment, that he made at the Red Elephant Club. And look, I said from the start, like, I don't think that it was what it appeared to be. And I know a lot of people kind of took it and ran. And I compared it to, Terry and Arnold after the Rose Bowl, where he kind of mentioned in passing that we have unfinished business and never said he was coming back. And everybody kind of latched on to him
He'll be
saying
here. He'll be
unfinished
here.
business. Right. And you see all these graphics that people make on social media, and, I don't want to say reputable news outlets, but certainly people that probably
Content
should know
farmers.
better.
Yeah.
Right. People should probably know better than to make a graphic that says Terry Arnold says he's returning to Alabama because he said unfinished business. And then when Terrion says, I'm not coming back and I'm going to the draft, which was his plan all along, obviously, it makes him look bad because people saw those graphics and they thought that he said he was coming back. And it looks like he's reneging on something when he never was. And this is a little bit different of a situation. I do think Ryan Grubb probably could have avoided saying what he did, just from a linguistic standpoint. You don't have to necessarily say those words, that I am your next offensive coordinator, but all the assistant coaches spoke at this event. They were all introduced. You probably could have just left it at whoever was introducing you saying, this is Ryan Grubb, the new offensive coordinator. You don't have to say it yourself. The quote doesn't have to go out there, and it doesn't really look as bad for you. But the same thing is true in terms of, he never said, I'm always going to be your offensive coordinator and I'm here forever. Like, I think anybody can understand that if you're in line or a candidate for a job, you're probably not going to start saying that's your job, even though you don't have it yet. And you're not going to say that the job you have is your former job because you haven't left yet. So from a logical standpoint, it made perfect sense that he would say he's the offensive coordinator of Alabama, because that's what he was. And the same thing would hold true for Chip Kelly when he was at UCLA, until the minute that he took the job at Ohio State, until the minute that Bill O'Brien took the job at Boston College. They're going to say they were what they were because that's what they were. So that's just, it doesn't surprise me. Again, I think he could have avoided it. But even I think yesterday at his press conference, he said he told Austin Mack, like, I may not be here that long. It's may only be a 1-year thing. It may be a 2-year thing. And even if Ryan Grubb did not get hired as the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, or as the offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks, he could be in line. He would have been in line, I think, for a head coaching job pretty soon here. He was already considered maybe briefly for the Washington job, and the next opening that came open this fall or this winter, he would be high on that list, I would imagine. So, and maybe he still will. So maybe you get Ryan Grubb for 1 year in the best case scenario, but it was never going to be a long-term thing. And yeah, I think the bigger question for me is how wide of a net did Kalen DeBoer cast in terms of trying to replace Ryan Grubb, or is this always the plan that if Grubb left, Sheridan would be his guy? I don't know if there's any serious thought or conversations around Kirby Moore. And it's a question of, do you bring in somebody else? You have to learn your system. You'd have to work with. Like that's a whole different animal. So, I do think there's legitimate questions about Nick Sheridan, given his track record and his inexperience, especially in the SEC. And we'll have to see how that all works out. But again, I don't know if it's like, if there was ever going to be a scenario where Ryan Grubb's your offensive coordinator for the next 3 years. Like, I just don't think that was ever going to be true.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, at the time that the Alabama staff met with the Red Elephant Club, which is where he made those comments, he was Alabama's offensive coordinator. So he didn't lie. He was Alabama's offensive coordinator. Like you've said multiple times, he was Alabama's OC until he wasn't. And that's just kind of the way it goes. I admit, not admit, but I agree with you that maybe shouldn't have made the comments in the way that maybe he said it. But at the same time, he wasn't lying at the time that he had said that. So
it's also one of those things that, and I love the next round, like friends of the show. I don't think typically coaches get quoted at those events. So to see that quote be out there on Twitter was a little bit surprising. Again, I'm not faulting them. Like, you're talking to the guy that was quoting Nick Saban at the Jimbo Fisher night, but I don't know if Ryan Grubb necessarily knew that was going to be broadcast to the entire country. I think sometimes there's maybe an expectation, realistically or not, that it stays within that room. But even then, you have a lot of well-connected people in that room that would probably go to other people and say, "Hey, Ryan Grubb said he's the offensive coordinator." But it's also one of those no crap. Of course he's the offensive coordinator. Like, what else is he? That's kind of what my response was when I saw that. I'm like, well, yeah. It's like, what do you think he's going to say? He's a defensive coordinator. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that I think got overblown from the start, just because people were excited and wanting to latch on to whatever they could, whatever shred of good news there was to be had about Ryan Grubb. And there was always, I think, a likely, if not, almost done certainty that he was going to be the next Seahawks coach.
Yeah, 100%. Nick Sheridan was tapped to be Alabama's new offensive coordinator, elevated from tight ends coach. Previously worked with DeBoer at Indiana during that 2019 season when DeBoer was the offensive coordinator. Nick Sheridan, this is actually a funny story. He was the quarterbacks coach for Tom Allen the year before DeBoer showed up. DeBoer gets hired. Tom Allen was telling me last week that, hey, Nick was the QB's coach. But DeBoer traditionally has worked with quarterbacks previously. And Tom Allen went to Nick Sheridan and said, "Hey man, we're going to let DeBoer work with quarterbacks. Can you shift to tight ends?" Sheridan was a little hesitant about that, but ultimately did. That 2019 Indiana offense benefited from it. When DeBoer left the next year to go to Fresno State, that's when Nick Sheridan was promoted to Indiana's offensive coordinator for the next 2 years under Tom Allen. I agree with you. I think there's a lot of questions here because you look at what DeBoer did with that Indiana offense in 2019. They were very, very good, right? They had Michael Penix. They jumped, I want to say 40 spots to top 50 total offense in the country. That Indiana team won 8 games for the first time in, almost 3 decades. The next year when Sheridan's only the OC, they took a step back. They took a pretty ginormous step back. The year following that, because he was OC for 2 years, took another step back. So a little worrisome maybe if you're Alabama. I know that there's a couple caveats with why maybe Indiana's offense took a step back those couple years. had some quarterback injuries, had some other injuries, like just seemed like it was a lot of bad news all around for those Indiana teams. Because his first year there, when Nick Sheridan was the OC after DeBoer left, I think Indiana still went 6-2. It was the COVID shortened season, but they climbed to top 15 in the country in the national polls. But then it was the season after that where they dealt with a bunch of injuries and things just kind of went sideways in a hurry. So a little worrisome about that. I think if you're an Alabama fan, the one thing that should maybe give you a little bit of hope is that DeBoer is still going to be there, and he has a fantastic track record as offensive coordinator, as a guy who can draw up schemes and game plans, as a guy who works with quarterbacks in virtually every aspect of the offense. I think that should give Alabama fans a little bit of hope that, hey, like, this is probably DeBoer's offense. It's going to run through him. He's going to be the guy that's scheming things up. He's going to be the guy that's constructing the game plan week to week. My guess is he will probably play a large role, if not just go ahead and take over play calling duties. Those are my quick thoughts. Do you have any other lingering thoughts about Sheridan as OC, DeBoer sticking around, obviously, as the primary offensive guy in the room?
Yeah, I think the last time we did a podcast, I kind of mentioned it's like Belichick and Brady. Like, these guys have been around each other for so long, Grubb and DeBoer, that you don't really know how to divvy up credit. They've obviously been very good wherever they went, but they've also been together, with the lone exception of Indiana. 2019, DeBoer was at Indiana, Grubb was at Fresno. Other than that, Fresno, Eastern Michigan, DeBoer had a few years at Southern Illinois when Grubb was still at Sioux Falls, but they've been tied at the hip. So this is where we're going to see, and both of them could be good. Like, it's not necessarily either or, like one of them is responsible and one of them is just a poser. Like, they both could be good at what they do. So, we're going to see. I think, once you separate some of these things, you start to see. And, I think it's still, there's always layers to it. Like, who's your offensive line coach? What's your talent level along the offensive line, which, there's still a problem at tackle, I would say. You have a lot of new players trying to fit in with each other. Parker Brailsford playing with Booker and Roberts, who he's never played with before. You have 2 new tackles, probably. You have wide receivers going to be looking different. How quickly does Ryan Williams come in? How does your running game look like with Justice Haynes and James Miller? What's your quarterback situation? How does your quarterbacks get along with Nick Sheridan? There's just a lot of variables, and the same thing's true on a defensive side. Not that we're talking about that, but you have a bunch of coaches who really haven't coached together on a defensive side either, and a bunch of freshmen potentially playing big roles. So, the overlying theme, I would say, is to expect all of this just to come together magically by September and look like a well-oiled machine that's going to win the SEC when you go to Wisconsin or when you play Georgia on September 28th. Like, that's not the most realistic expectation in my mind. There's just a lot of new parts and pieces to fit together here. And there was last year. And that's something Tyler Booker was saying all along at the beginning of the year. Like, we're not used to Tommy Rees. We're not used to some of these guys we're playing with. You could multiply that by 10 on what they're going to be facing this year with all the new coaches and systems and calls and checks and players. And it's going to be a lot. You have 15 practices in the spring. You have 20 something in August, and boom, you got to be ready to go. So that's, keep your expectations in check for September. And if they overperform, they have a great September, they beat Georgia, they go on the road to Wisconsin and they win, and hell, that's a really good result. But even if it's not, and you take a loss or two, I don't think it's the end of the world. The sky won't be falling here.
Yeah. So we'll got a lot of time to dive into that. In the coming weeks, we'll probably start up some spring ball preview pods. We've got a lot of content coming on the Bama 247 site to look forward to that. Second half of today's show, wanted to talk a little bit of hoops. Alabama men's basketball entering the final stretch of the regular season. First place, still atop the SEC. 17-7 overall, 9-2 in league play entering this week. Half game up on both Auburn and South Carolina. Full game up on Tennessee, and 2 games up on Florida and Kentucky. They have a pretty, you've mentioned this, tougher schedule down the stretch here than maybe what they had in January. starting with Texas A&M on Saturday. They also have to play Florida twice. They have to go to Kentucky, to Ole Miss, and then they wrap up the season with Arkansas in early March before they get to the SEC championship game. My gut feeling, Mike, kind of curious what you think. If they hold serve at home, Alabama, 4 of their 7 last games here are going to be at home. Hold serve at home. If you can find a way to steal 2 of 3 on the road, I think the Ole Miss game is probably primed to win. So that would put you at 5-2 down the stretch here. If you can find a way to go 6-1, you probably win the league. 5-2, I think, gives you a shot, but I think, teams like Auburn, maybe even Tennessee, depending on their schedule, could also hit that 14-win mark. But 15, I think, really puts you in good position to potentially win the league. What do you think about just Alabama's chances down the stretch here to win another SEC regular season title?
Yeah. And sorry, just as we've been talking here, I've been getting a few responses back from Alabama on my records requests, and one of those was a term sheet, anything that they agreed to with Ryan Grubb, and they said there was no responsive records on that. So
interesting.
Apparently, Ryan Grubb never signed anything, is what Alabama says. So, and 6-1, yeah, 6-1. I think that would do it. There might be a situation where Auburn runs the table and they would both finish with 3 losses. You would split the tiebreaker because you want 1-1, and then it would come down to how you fared against the number 1, in that case probably the number 3 through number 16 seeds. You just go down the list and check your records. Either way, it would be a co-SEC title. The tiebreaker would just only apply to
would decide who the 1 and 2 seeds are.
Right. Yeah, the seed, which at the end of the day is not really that important. It just depends on who you play and what time you play, on Friday at the tournament. So yeah, I mean, either way, like, they're in a good spot. I know Nate Oates loves talking about regular season SEC titles. I think it's a really good thing. It's a good goal to set. They've won it twice, which is really good, but that's not the end goal.
Right.
And I'm not saying he's overlooking the end goal. I'm just saying if they don't win an SEC regular season title, I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world. And if they go and win the tournament, if they go and make a deeper run in the NCAA tournament, then nobody will care that you didn't win the regular season title. So, 6-1, 5-2, 5-2 probably puts you in a position where you need Auburn to lose at least a game, Tennessee maybe to lose a game. If you lose twice to Tennessee, that's probably worse in terms of a one final loss for Alabama. If you take another loss at Tennessee, that's going to be bad for a tiebreaker. If you beat Tennessee and lose to Ole Miss or Kentucky or Florida, that's a little bit more helpful in terms of splitting the tiebreaker with Tennessee. But again, a lot of this stuff, we talk about in February. By the time March rolls around, it becomes relatively irrelevant. And winning the SEC regular season title, winning the SEC tournament last year really didn't help Alabama beat San Diego State, and that's what matters. Like, and that's college basketball. It's can you get to March, and if you do get to March, can you win 6 games in a row? And Alabama hasn't been able to do that under Nate Oates so far. And again, they've gone a lot further than previous coaches have, and that's a really good thing. But if they lose 3 of their next 7 games, but then win every game after that, nobody will care that you lost 3 games in February. Everybody will just care that you won every single game you needed to in March. So that's what I have to say about that.
No, I think that's totally fair. And we published a Bama 247 roundtable where we all kind of discussed, what does Alabama need to do to maintain their position, but also, what's going to be the biggest factor in their postseason success. I think we were all pretty much, defense, right? Like we know this offense is going to score points. We know that most efficient offense in college basketball, according to KenPom, they have routinely been there, either number 1 or number 2 the entire season. Defense has not been there, right? Like, I ranked 73rd in adjusted defensive efficiency, according to KenPom. At one point in time, they were the worst scoring defense in the SEC. They still have a lot of moments where it's just, they're just not getting stops and they're just outscoring people. You and I have both talked about how that's, you can try and live that way in the postseason, but that is a huge gamble because one cold shooting night and your season's over. Do we think now that we're into mid-February, there's 7 games left in the regular season, like, is there a viable path for them to make the necessary adjustments defensively? Or do we just think that this is are they just going to have to outscore people down the stretch here? Like, what do we think, what can they do to improve the defense to give them a shot at a pretty deep run in March?
Yeah, I think I said this back in January. Like, the more data points you continue to collect about this team, whether it was playing Purdue, playing Arizona, playing Creighton, playing Tennessee, playing Auburn twice, the more data points you saw, the more you questioned how they'd be able to perform against high level teams. And last week's loss to Auburn, I don't think changed that. Like, I think it was another data point that you play a really good team and you lose and you have problems on defense, and the same things keep happening in terms of letting a big man, run all over you, then the more you have to wonder if that's just the team you are, and that's just what you're going to have to be, without Charles Bediako, and trying to use Grant Nelson at the 5, which has kind of been their move recently. And you have a smaller lineup. You're not rebounding as well. You need Grant Nelson to be that guy underneath. And I don't know if he's magically going to turn into that, on February 16th, where he's playing that way in March 20th. Like, I just don't know if that's going to happen. Like, he's kind of is the player that he is. And that's not really a in the paint big man. He's not really a rim protector. He's a lanky outside shooter and driver. So, they've tried different things. I mean, if Nick Pringle somehow gets way back on track from where he was a couple weeks ago, then that helps. But even then, Nick Pringle's not really known for his defense. He's kind of an explosive, above the rim, athletic big man. So they don't really have that guy in their roster. I mean, Mohamed Wage is the closest match, but he's had problems with fouling. So for it to all come together magically where they need it to, I just don't know. Like, I think they are what they are. And yes, there's a capability, there's a possibility that they can outscore teams. And you have a really good shooting night where Griffin's going off and Sears is going off, Estrada, right? So maybe Nelson too. Like, you can put up 85, 90, 95 points, but you got to be able to defend too. And if you're giving up 90, 95, 100, then you're still going to lose. So if you ask me right now, like, what happens to this team, I still think they're a team that probably loses on the second weekend of the tournament when you're playing a really good, Sweet 16 or early at 8 team. But you never know. There weird things happen. That's kind of the beauty of March Madness is the unpredictability of it. But I just don't see it in terms of this defense suddenly turning into what they haven't been so far.
Yeah. Well, and I just, I'd go as far to say that, like, if they can't even get subtle improvement, right? Like, you don't need an elite defense for how good this offense is. You just need a defense that can get enough stops on the other end so that your offense can do what it does. There's a realistic shot that, like, if they get the wrong matchup and they go cold, they're not getting out of the first weekend. Like, that's the nature of the beast. They could also, have the most perfect draw and shoot their way to, tie game with 4 minutes left in the Elite Eight. Like, you never know. Like, that's, like you said, that's the beauty of March Madness. But you look at, kind of where they're trending. Joe Lunardi, I think, has them on the 3 line or somewhere between the 3 and the 4 line, looking at his latest projection. So they have them on the 3 line in the West region. Kansas is your 2 seed. I'm not sure you want like that's your Sweet 16 matchup. I'm not sure that, they're getting through that if they can get there, right? The other teams in their quad, Morehead State, Ole Miss, they seem to have been found out in SEC play, but also Florida Atlantic and Gonzaga. Gonzaga usually traditionally has a big man. You look at the, if they somehow drop to the 4 line, you look at the number 1 seeds, Arizona, they've played, Houston's bowling the Big 12, UConn, similar mold, but they're very versatile offensively. And then obviously Purdue is another team that they've played this season. Like, there's just, it seems like, you can see them get into the second weekend, but then they're going to have to play a team with a big man. And that's where I'm just like, I just don't think they got the dudes to do it, or they better shoot 60% from the floor that night. Like, that's, and when you're living that way, I feel like that's just a little too dangerous. And, keep going back to the defense. Like, I think I wrote this earlier. It's very reminiscent of the, I'm a football guy. Very reminiscent of the Chiefs when Patrick Mahomes was finally the starter at quarterback. The only defense that could stop those Chiefs teams was its own because they couldn't stop anybody. And so they just limited the ceiling of that team. I kind of look at this Alabama team in the same way. This offense is going to score its points. If the defense can't get stops, this team's in trouble. And so that could mean out on the first weekend. That could also mean, 4 minutes from the Final Four. I don't know. It kind of depends on the draw, but that's kind of, I don't like that variability of my basketball team going into March Madness if I'm an Alabama fan, because you don't know what you're going to get. As good as the offense and as steady and consistent and efficient as they've been all year. I don't know. That's a tricky game to play, and that's a gamble that I don't like. Put it that way.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just you have to trust your gut on what a team is. And I remember 2 years ago with this team, there was issues, different sorts of issues, but chemistry wise, and they were kind of smaller in the backcourt. They had trouble shooting the three. They had trouble defending in some cases, and that all just played out. Like they went into San Diego and they were a higher seeded team, but you just had the sense they weren't going to beat Notre Dame. And that's what happened. And sometimes just what you think is going to happen is what happens. So, again, the more data points you have, the bigger sample size you have on this team, there's still questions. And even with the game that they had against LSU, they had issues with the big man in the first half, the 7-foot guy, Will Baker. They outscored LSU in the second half and were able to win that way. But the Auburn game was bad, and the Georgia game was very ugly for a while. And you just have to wonder what's going to happen against Kentucky. You're going to have to wonder the 2 Florida games. Florida just annihilated Auburn.
They went on the road and beat Kentucky. And I know that Kentucky's not the team that they used to be at home, but that's still a hard thing to do. And they made it look pretty easy.
Ole Miss is a much better team. They're 13-1 at home. With Chris Beard, that's going to be a huge game on the road for Alabama.
You get a second crack at Tennessee. I think you like the fact that game's at home, but still that's,
Right. And Tennessee's been beatable. I mean, there's been a few teams now that have beaten them. And that actually, if you had me rank the toughest games for Alabama, even though Tennessee might be the best team on that list, I don't know if that's the toughest game. I think one of those road games probably would be. And Arkansas is kind of a sneaky team where they should be a lot better than what they are. They're 3-8. That team has been a top 2 or 3 team in the SEC the last few years. They have the talent to do it. If you told me they came into Coleman Coliseum March, whatever it is, and won that Saturday, I think they're very much capable of doing that. So, the back half of the schedule, as we've talked about, I think is tougher. And we'll see that play out. I would still be surprised if this Alabama team runs the table.
Me too. But the one thing that really, again, I know I've said this before, they're 9-2 in the SEC. Yeah, they got battered pretty bad against both Tennessee and Auburn. Those are their 2 conference losses. This is an Alabama team that has yet to have a silly head scratching loss. And I think there's something to be said about that. If you're looking for the optimistic side here, that's why I think 5-2 is probably realistic down the stretch. Maybe, if you really want to be optimistic about it, if they're the 3 or the 4 seed, I think fair expectation to say that, hey, they should get to the second weekend. They should get to the second weekend just because they seem to beat the teams that they should, and they just can't seem to beat the teams that they, aren't expected to beat. And just, again, like you mentioned, more data points just seems like maybe that's the book on this Alabama team this season. And, you just hope that they can just do what they're supposed to do or live up to their seeding by the time we get to March. And, it just kind of, put themselves in position and see what they can do on the second weekend, because that seems to be where they're projected to be. Any other final thoughts on men's hoops before we tie a bow on this show?
No. Think we're good. We'll have to be watching the transfer portal. With Keon Sabb going in, from Michigan, the safety who played at IMG, with obviously a few Alabama players, but his primary recruiter at Michigan was Courtney Morgan, who's now the GM of Alabama. So he went into the portal on Friday morning. Former top 100 prospect, has played a decent amount at Michigan, and obviously that's a position of need for Alabama, with Caleb Downs and Jalen Key being gone. So we'll have to see where that one lands this weekend.
A lot of available playing time for Keon Sabb if you would like to make a trip to Tuscaloosa. I know that like the class schedule probably I don't know if he would show up until even after the semester's over.
Right.
But
I would doubt it at this point. I mean, we're halfway through the semester almost.
yeah. So, but I mean, hey, like if he wants to come join an Alabama secondary, play for Kane Womack, there's a lot of available playing time, I think, especially at some of the safety spots in Alabama's defense. So I think that would be a pretty big pickup for Alabama in the transfer portal if that's what happens this weekend. We'll keep all our eye out. But that's all we got on today's show. Mike, appreciate you joining us as always. We'll be back sometime early next week. Hopefully we'll get back on the 2-show schedule, start to look a little bit ahead to spring ball, keep track on both men's and women's hoops. Women play Auburn on Sunday at Coleman. So we'll keep tabs on what happens there. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 247 Sports. Feel like we're always running a special. Put a link to that in the show notes so you guys can take advantage of it. Thank you all again for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.